Hello, everybody. Welcome back to episode 16 of the Progressive Democrats of Howard County podcast. I am the president of Progressive Democrats of Howard County and co-host of the podcast, Jake Burdett. I am joined by my co-host, Hiruy. How you doing, Hiruy?
Hey, Jake. I feel like we were just on doing a podcast, but I think we were on doing another podcast to introduce our slate members in a different context. But today on this episode, we want to talk about something that's somewhat different. And Jake, you'll expand on that a little bit more, I'm sure. But I wanted to sort of discuss the genesis of this. After the Ukraine and Russia conflict started, I don't know how long. It feels like 10 years ago. We noticed that there were different views, a spectrum of views on, foreign policy, basically who's right, who's wrong, or just the different nuances. So we thought it would be good to have that discussion, we have a couple of people who, have who have the background within our PDHC group to talk about that. So here we are. So Jake.
Yes, yeah, bit of a deja vu moment. We were talking to our two guests, Rick Kohn and Eduardo Ribeiro. And if people are more interested about the specifics of their background, I encourage people to watch parts 1 and 2 of episode 15 of the Progressive Democrats podcast, where we interviewed them as HOCO for us slate members for their Race and Democratic Central Committee. But we are here to talk about, something very different. And both of these two gentlemen, who are actually the co-leads of our Progressive Democrats of Howard County International Solidarity Committee. They are both very passionate about just that, international solidarity, and especially U.S. foreign policy and the destruction that is responsible for abroad. So Eduardo and Rick, thank you both for joining us tonight again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah, and I guess before we talk about any specific international situations, whether that be Russia, Ukraine, or anything else, do you just want to kind of tell the audience, like, what is your general take on U.S. foreign policy, and I guess sort of the lens that you analyze these international events through? I guess we can start with Eduardo.
Well, as somebody who grew up in a country that is culturally very close to the U.S., I would say, in terms of mass media and Hollywood and all that. We've always been fed a U.S.-centric vision of the world's events, wars and all that. It takes a while for you to catch up on what's really going on. But at the same time, growing up in a country whose government was often sabotaged by foreign powers, or propped up, depending on who was in power, you start paying more attention to those things closely. I grew up, at least my early teen years, in a country that was under a military dictatorship that was strongly supported by the US. So you start realizing that the good guys in the movies are not necessarily always good in real life. And that's when I started getting more and more interested about what's the situation in neighboring countries, or culturally close to us, historically close to us, like the countries in Africa. I started reading more about that. And you start realizing that when, for instance, Nelson Mandela was fighting apartheid in South Africa, and the US political establishment, including Democrats, considered him a terrorist, he was already being supported by the left in Latin America, while the US was, propping up the apartheid regime, not only in South Africa, but also in Namibia, and sponsoring Namibian groups to attack Angola, Latin America. In this case, Cuba was sending troops to help Angola, preserve its independence. So you start realizing that there's so much more in common, even though we are fed a northern hemisphere type of mass media, mass culture. There's so much more in common with the countries across the ocean, across the Atlantic, or our neighboring countries in South America. We all faced historically the same struggles. We are all have all been colonized. We've been enslaved. I myself am a Brazilian mestizo whose ancestors were also, people of African descent. So when you start taking things into consideration from a historical perspective, you start seeing that you can never analyze things like racism and inequality only within your own group. You realize that you have so much more in common with people that you have never met, and I think that's an eye-opening experience. It makes you realize how much more in common you have with the rest of them. So yes, just to answer that question in a more straightforward manner, I think the more you study, the more you pay attention to the news, and you look for your own information and you filter it and you analyze it, you realize that you have to really be careful to not just ingest information that has not been fully digested. It's been spoon-fed by CNN and MSNBC. So
Yeah, and Rick, same question. What is your general take on U.S. foreign policy and the lens that these issues should be sort of viewed through?
Yeah, so I came through the same system as everyone in America. A lot of propaganda in the school and the movies and the media. But I grew up, I'm a little older, so I grew up, started paying attention during the Vietnam War. Toward the end of that war, when I was, a young man, not actually a man, not eligible to be drafted. My brother was drafted. My cousin was drafted and seriously injured. My brother dodged the draft. So it was very pertinent in my household, and it was not a popular war as I knew it, although I learned later that it was very popular when it started. And then I experienced all of those other wars that we had since then, and I didn't see the reason for any of them when they started, although they were all popular. And it was all pretty much like what we have now today with Ukraine, or maybe last month. It seems like it's fading very quickly. It always starts out that we must defend these people. We must defend democracy. It's our freedom. They're coming for us next. It's all the same arguments every single time. A lot of disinformation, a lot of just incredible rhetoric, a lot of the news media uniformly telling us the same disinformation, false information that is to try to get us emotionally engaged in these wars. And then, we say we're going to fight to the death to defend ourselves and defend our whoever. And then the gas prices go up to $5. We're like, we're done with this. It's too much. We can't handle that. That is how they all go. That is how Iraq went the first time, the second time, Afghanistan. That's how it always goes. And so I'd say at every one of those cases, I was opposed to the Central American wars, all of the wars that didn't actually come to actual invasions, but just sanctioned economic warfare. People died, so many people died, millions of people died from US foreign policy. I think it's immoral. I think immorality is something that is almost never mentioned, but it's immoral from the start. So there you have it. So if it's immoral, why are we doing it? And that's where I stand on this as well. So I don't need to get into the details of, is Putin, Hitler or what have you. All we need to know is that, every time they tell us the same thing. They tell us that there are, in Syria, that there were chemical attacks by, that turn out they weren't actually by the government, they were just staged. They turn out to be incubators that had children that were unplugged in Iraq, which actually never happened. There were weapons of mass destruction which the UN said that they were pretty sure they found 99%. If there was any, it wasn't very much. And of course, the US would never have invaded if they thought there was a risk that there were still weapons of mass destruction that could be used against them. They waited until they got them all. So, logical, you can tell that these same sorts of lies happen, and it happens over and over and over again. And they think people aren't going to live long enough to figure it out. But I've lived long enough to figure it out. And I hope that I can convince you young people here, that's how it works.
Yeah, I've definitely lived long enough to figure it out too, and I mean, and it's the after the Ukraine like that conflict, the Russia and Ukraine conflict started, I think for me, three things were like clear. The first one was very scary to me, in that I did not know what to believe. I can't listen to CNN. I can't look at the newspaper that's in the US, and or go to Twitter or whatever and take information that would be helpful in providing me, helping me shape or create or form an objective and not the right opinion, because nobody can have the that's just that's too much to ask, but at least more informed opinion about what's going on. So that's the first thing, and that's really scary to me, because that's we're in that state right now on a lot of issues. The second thing is how extremely racist this world is, like extremely. You've had Yemen children 4, 5, 6 years old, they've been dying, they've been getting killed for years at the hands of the Saudi, the US backed Saudi and the UAE. That's been going on for years. The Syrian children, Iraq, Afghanistan, like this, and Palestine, one of the longest lasting conflicts that's been going on. And I never the way that the media and people felt the suffering of Ukrainian people, rightfully so, because they, anybody who's suffering, they should you should feel it that way. But it was just so cognitively, it was so weird to see that, because they were another conflict is in in East Africa, in Tigray, right? And you have children, again, just children just dying, just needlessly getting killed, right? So that was very jarring to me. And then the second, the third thing is the hypocrisy of it all, right? So you have this there's been a 20-25 year war going on in Iraq and Afghanistan, and all of a sudden when this takes place, it's the outrage, right? There's just no reflection, self-reflection there. So but I guess I just wanted to vent a little bit about that. But I think my question is, I think this to the first part, because this is the one that I think we should really be focused on, is how do we ensure that we are consuming the right information to have an objective opinion on, an informed opinion on these issues, because that's the tough part for me. And I think I think a lot of people are lost on this because they don't know what to trust, and that you can easily exploit that.
Well, I would say pay attention to the voices that are being censored. There is a reason why they're being censored. There's a reason why there's some discourse that it's not only widespread, but it's state sponsored, and there are voices that are being silenced out there. Look for those voices. Maybe they're the ones telling something closer to the truth. I think that's again going back to my own personal experience. That's the information that was easily found in our libraries, our schools, our school book back when my country was a dictatorship. That wasn't the information that was bothering the powerful. One that was being censored, that had to go underground. Those are the people that were closer to conveying the truth. So I think I've been in this country for more than 20 years now. I've never seen such a huge campaign of censorship as I've seen now with it.
Twitter helps you find some of those voices because they actually cancel people's accounts, and they also make it so you can't search. But they do this one thing for some accounts where they put this little statement that says this is sponsored by Russian state media, even though it's not true. And that just means that the opinion is something they don't want you to take seriously. So following your guidance there, I guess those are accounts that are just sort of highlighted that maybe you should actually look at what they're saying. I'm not saying it's necessarily accurate, but I'm just saying it's that there's an attempt to try to discredit that without any real evidence to discredit it. So they come up with some sort of fabrication that it's, Russian media. Like it's juvenile almost.
Yeah, I think it's important to take into consideration a little bit of a historical perspective. If we have been lied to before throughout so many different wars, including, as you mentioned, Vietnam and Iraq and Syria and so forth, why all of a sudden they would be telling the truth now, right? A little more, let's be a little less cheerleaders of wars and take a step back and look at the reasons why people are so eager, so excited, so giddy at supporting a certain side of the story. Also, again, historical perspective. Of course, many people in this country have been paying attention to the situation in Ukraine since February of this year. They weren't paying attention before because CNN didn't tell them it was important. Fox News, MSNBC, all these other networks weren't telling them it was important. All of a sudden, it is the most important thing, and people who had never even heard of Ukraine are having, Ukrainian flags in their profile, Twitter, and even in their own houses and all that. As somebody from a different country, originally, who's living here now, has a family here, has a life in here, but still pays attention to the rest of the world, I would say that since 2014, for instance, I've seen this movement of neo-Nazis in Brazil going to Ukraine, where they found inspiration and where they found training for whatever they were planning to do. We have been paying attention to this longer than many people, I would say. And then when they say, well, I don't know why the global south is not fully supporting the US in this enterprise. Well, first of all, the global south has its own interests, and they have their own history, and they've been paying attention to it from a different perspective. So a little more respect towards different opinions, including the ones that are being censored in the US. I think it would go a long way for people to make informed decisions. Stop minimizing and ignoring or diminishing the opinions of people in the global south. I think that that would help too. Like when you read, for instance, African countries are letting themselves to be misled by Russia, as if they didn't have their own knowledge, their own interests. So there's always this condescending tone. Either you are with Europe or you're not. Well, we have a history in which Europe has not been very nice to the rest of us. So maybe if we take things with a grain of salt, or maybe a gigantic egg of salt, we have a reason for that.
Yeah,
Eduardo, I wanted to follow up on that question about the Nazi trainings in Brazil. Does Brazil have a similar history to Argentina, where the German Nazis came and got involved in the government there after the war?
Definitely. Many of the people who are now volunteering to go fight alongside the Ukrainian troops, they are from the south of Brazil, which they like to say it's more European. than the rest of the country. I'm from central Brazil. I come from, different backgrounds, indigenous, Black, and Portuguese. But many people in the South like to not just to state, but to brag about the fact that they are more European than the rest. And that's where the neo-Nazi problem is growing. And that's where neo-fascists like Bolsonaro has a story. And when the Russians destroyed the center of the foreign legion in somewhere in Ukraine, there are many Brazilian uh, extreme right wingers on YouTube whining and complaining about it because they thought war was, the way they mistreat the poor Black and indigenous people in Brazil. It would be just a one-way violence act. No. When they faced the real war, most of them went back to Brazil complaining about a Brazilian congressman, actually from a state parliament in São Paulo. He was caught on audio saying that he went to volunteer also in Ukraine, and he was drooling over the Ukrainian refugees, saying that, oh my God, they're so beautiful and they're blonde, they all look like models, and they'll be such an easy target because they're poor and desperate. So that's the kind of people who are being recruited. So it's important to take all those things into consideration. Why, the most racist, most conservative, most xenophobic people in Brazil, in southern Brazil especially, are going to volunteer for this cause. They see commonalities that many of us brown people don't see.
And yeah, I have a sort of a follow-up point to something Hiruy mentioned earlier of, he's talking about the racism that's kind of displayed through the difference in reaction of the American people to, when they see white Ukrainians getting killed versus, brown Yemenis being, genocided by U.S. foreign policy for the last, 7+ years or however long it's been going on. And yes, there's definitely validity to that. The U.S. public is incredibly racist, and I think it's easier for them to ignore it when the victims abroad are Black and brown. But at the same time, we can't even run that experiment fairly. And I think this is a testament to what Eduardo and Rick are saying about the media, because the Ukrainians being white might make them more sympathetic victims in the eyes of a white supremacist America. But at the same time, when the media is literally for 24/7 for months saying, feel bad for the Ukrainians, Russia bad, Ukraine, like poor victim Ukraine, like that's the only like takeaway that people can really pull away. And I question if we saw the media do that with Yemen, of look how bad this genocide in Yemen is. Look at what U.S. foreign policy, or look at what Saudi Arabia is doing. Then maybe Americans would have a similar takeaway. But that's the thing, is that when the person responsible for the genocide or the invasion is the United States or somebody being supported by the United States, the media completely gives it a pass. It just doesn't get talked about, to the point where probably most people don't even know that anything's going on in Yemen, because despite it being a massive humanitarian crisis, the media, rarely ever talks about it ever. The only place you can find anything is international outlets, online news sources. And so that was kind of my biggest takeaway, and something that really scared me is like, it's now almost 20 years later that the invasion of Iraq and all that happened. And even a lot of like elected Republicans will now admit that was a mistake and it was based on lies. And everybody likes to think, well, we would never fall for something like that again. We learned our lesson. Hey, we're not going to make the same mistake. And then here we are. It's happening. And this is not to defend anything that Russia or Vladimir Putin is doing, because I do disagree with the invasion of Ukraine. But I think that we should, as a country, learn some more lessons here and be a little bit more skeptical before just blindly believing a narrative about a country that most of us couldn't identify on a map. Like, 6 months ago and just blindly believing, this side is unapologetically in the right, this side is unapologetically in the wrong. And when you have that black and white narrative, that's how things like neo-Nazi influence in the Ukrainian military get swept under the rug, and how arming these elements can be justified. And that's really dangerous. I just feel like we're making a lot of the same mistakes. We are not having nuanced conversations about this at all. We are, any outside opinions get jumped to censorship. And an example of that, Hiruy and I, when this all was going on, we watched, I think it was an Oliver Stone documentary on YouTube covering back some of the history of Ukraine back to 2014 and some of the neo-Nazi elements. And I'm not vouching for everything that was in that documentary, saying I agree with all of it, but we watched that on YouTube. I believe now it's not on YouTube anymore. I believe that documentary has since been censored, scrubbed off the internet. And that leads to like, what can I I don't even know what to believe. So yeah, that was just a takeaway that I had from this whole.
I would encourage viewers to look for that documentary, though. I probably, now one level of censorship is Google. So Google censors things in the search, which would make it hard to find. But I watched it after it had been censored from YouTube on a third party, and I don't remember what search engine I used, but some of them haven't got their algorithm quite up to par yet, and things get through. So don't just Google it, but search for it, look for it, Oliver Stone documentary, Ukraine. There's actually two of them, a new one and one closer to the 2014 coup, and which was a US-backed coup. And in that documentary, there are things they don't want you to hear, like current US security advisors who were talking about the detailed planning of who they were going to put in power and what power different people would have and so forth. So it was very much like several other coups, Libya, Honduras, Bolivia, attempted coups in Venezuela and Nicaragua. A lot of them had a lot of similarities. So we start to see that same pattern over and over again with these coups. And then, sometimes after the coup governments are put in place, they don't last. And then we go in with more military aid. And there's always that risk with all of these interventions. What you don't learn about in school, we learn about some of them in school, but we don't learn about all of them. And I looked, someone said there were only 6 years in US history that the US did not bomb or invade another country. And I tried to find those 6 years and I could not find them. Jimmy Carter claims he was president during some of them. He was bombing El Salvador. He was paying for bombs. So no, those don't count. So I think there probably were no years. And you start looking at even before the Republic, even before the Declaration of Independence, there were multiple wars against Native people around the country. And a thing that I thought of historically is very interesting is Henry David Thoreau's Civil Disobedience, which inspired Martin Luther King and inspired Gandhi later in the start of the Mexican-American War, or during the Mexican-American War. He had two major problems with the US government: slavery and the Mexican-American War. And with respect to the Mexican-American War, he said the thing that repulsed him the most was that of all these atrocities that were being committed, what was most repulsive and made us most responsible was that they were being committed by our government. That's the government he was calling to overthrow, the US government, because of what it was doing to other people. And that made it our responsibility. Whereas people think that, you can only oppose some foreign government because of what they do to you. But no, what your own government does is your responsibility. And it is our responsibility as Americans morally to oppose our government and to try to do whatever we can to at least lessen the number of conflicts that we have.
Exactly. The thing is, when you have a certain international perspective on the situation, it's hard for you to take these sectarian approaches to foreign policy. For instance, I'll give you an example. I think it's very close to me because, when people say Black Lives Matter, in my mind, there's always this voice saying, yes, everywhere. Black Lives Matter everywhere. They matter in Haiti too. They matter in Guatemala. They matter in Brazil. I think that people lose perspective of this because of American exceptionalism, which is the woke, well-dressed cousin of white supremacy. You can have people of all races, and you see that with the American government agencies and the military. You can have people of all races doing the bit of doing the job of American supremacy, white supremacy, American exceptionalism. I'll give you an example. We had some left-wing governments down in Brazil that really improved the quality of life of people in general, including people of color, including people like me, for instance. I'm a Brazilian mulatto. I don't know if that term is politically correct nowadays. But yes, I am. I'm very proud of my every little aspect of my ethnic background. And much of what I am as a human being is because of the lessons I've learned from my side of the family whose ancestors were enslaved by degree of European and their descendants. So, yeah. When I entered college back in the late 80s, early 90s, I was surprised to see that in the middle of my country, one of the most racially diverse countries in the world, the majority of people who were in college were white people, white in the sense of European-looking people. And it was the public university, the best universities in Brazil are public. And for some reason, people who could afford a private college were the ones who could not afford getting to the public university either. So these left-wing governments I was talking about, they democratized access to higher education. So you started seeing people who looked like me, people who were darker than me, indigenous people walking around also universities and all that. But unfortunately, everybody knows who our president is right nowadays. Is a guy named Jair Bolsonaro, who's the South American Trump, who wouldn't have gotten where he did if it wasn't for some conspiracy involving in a large part U.S. foreign. The coup, the parliamentary coup that led to the rise of Bolsonaro to power was basically orchestrated during the Obama administration. Here we have somebody who was elected under the banner of hope, of inclusion, and he continued the foreign policy of any other president in the history of the United States. So when you talk about empowering people of color everywhere, and then you see that you're not taking into consideration other countries like my country, like me, and like the minorities and even majorities in countries like Bolivia, for instance, I would say you're full of crap. Because I don't see. I think the fact that I'm from a country in which some people say it's the largest African or country of African and outside of Africa. And you see that some of the few governments that actually took into consideration making education and healthcare and the economy more inclusive and benefiting, of course, many of the minorities that were long excluded from power. And then, an American democratic government kind of interferes with that in a way that leads to the rise of somebody like Jair Bolsonaro, neo-fascist. People have to take responsibility. I think that's a huge part of. You want to have an opinion about foreign policy? Take responsibility for the previous mistakes. You have to take into consideration. I don't want in 20 years, the majority of the American people apologizing for Yemen, as many people now recognize that invading Iraq was a bad idea. Guess what? Millions of people had their lives destroyed because of that. take your apology and place it in a comfy location, because it's late. When you play with people's lives like that, when you sabotage a country, it takes forever to rebuild what you have finally conquered. That's why I'm so proud of Bolivia, for instance, where there was a coup d'etat that was, cheer-led by the United States and Europe and all that, but the people of Bolivia fought, and soon they had restored their democracy, and now they're keeping people accountable. They're making them accountable. The people who perpetrated the coup were responsible for the deaths of protesters and the destruction of the democracy in Bolivia for a short while. They're now being brought to justice, and Europe doesn't want that. The European Union says that's wrong. The US say that's wrong, and then they whine about January 6th. Well, I'll tell you something. In back down in Bolivia, people were being their homes were being invaded and burned. Protesters were being killed. Evo Morales barely escaped. There was, for instance, a female mayor, a woman, who was made to march through the streets, humiliated, painting thrown on her, naked, by the coup orchestrator. That compared to January 6th, I'm sorry, I think that is a much higher, a larger problem there. They destroyed a government that was elected by the majority of their people, and now the U.S. are demanding that the people who were responsible for the coup and responsible for massacres are free. They want them to be freed. Now, if they were American lives, if they were white lives, if they were European lives, nobody would have think about demanding that. The people who were killed, the people whose will in an election was disrespected, those are not white people. They're not Europeans. So they expect people like us. Let's just take it quietly and forgive very quickly. Things that in the US, as we can see, they don't do so. It's hard when you're trying to think more locally, when you have all this familiarity with what's going on abroad, and you know that political decisions in this country, because of the oversight power that the country exerts in in the rest of the world, your political decisions here will affect people in most of the world. So we need to be more responsible about that. And now with the war again in Ukraine, take a step back, breathe, evaluate, think about the history of the recent history and the ancient history of this country in foreign wars, and don't be so quick to support one side or the other. Skepticism when it comes to human lives, that's very important.
I totally agree there. I think the skepticism is important. I think just related to what really scares me is how the public view and public opinion coalesced around a specific narrative, how that happened so quickly. I mean, it was very swift how that happened. And for example, I think it is worth Twitter putting state-sponsored media on CNN. I mean, that's what it boils down to. CNN, MSNBC, Fox. These are, I think, would be the state-sponsored equivalent of, the Russian, oligarchy, right? So, I think though, we're probably, I mean, this is escalating. Like every day you see reports that the U.S. is sending more arms, or like providing support in one way or another. So these normalized levels of increased involvement in this conflict, it troubles me. So it's going to be like it looks like, it feels like it's more difficult. It's going to be difficult to unwind this. So I don't know what the end game. I don't know what the end game is, and I certainly don't view what's going on there in terms of who's righteous or what's moral or immoral. I think at the end of the day, it's about money. Who has, so this, if you can see a conflict and figure out, if you can't figure out whose money is being affected, then you don't have the complete picture of what's going on. And that's, to me, that's the, that's what's lacking in terms of like the exposure, like to, what's going on there. So, and yeah, I mean, I think, US foreign policy, what I say is US foreign policy kills, right? And, that's been at play. I can tell you in East Africa right now, it's, it has had a huge impact there, adverse impact. But I can also say, Chinese foreign policy has had adverse impact there. Russian foreign policy has had adverse impact there. I guess my point is, I think, I don't know what the answer is, but I don't know what the right answer is, but I don't know if the right answer is, this where we're seeing, these multiple, superpowers, just these huge elephants trampling, like they're fighting and they're trampling every, like all the, the small, the small, like the small animals, I guess figuratively speaking, but that's, that's really, what's happening. So I don't have a point here. I just, I think, to the way I think about it, just to close off this thought is someone that, like, the traditional way of analyzing what's going on there, where, you have, group of like leftist or centrist or right wing, their views, to me, that has not been helpful so far. So there are people, I mean, forget about the right and the center, forget about that. But there are people on the left who have, there's a diverging view there. Some have, this view where, and there's a spectrum of views there. Like there are a group of people on the left who have like a more nuanced approach in what's going on in Latin America, but those same people would go to East Africa and would have a completely, misinformed and completely, distorted view that's only based on who is the opposing, who is the opposing counterparty to the conflict. So because the U.S. holds a certain view, and that's like it seemed it was reactionary, so it wasn't helpful to me. I thought John Mearsheimer was very helpful to me in terms of evaluating what's going on, just very straightforward, and it was very what the giveaway of why he was credible was because he was persona non grata in the U.S. foreign policy think tank. Like he's not, so like he's outside the group think. He may not have the right view on everything, but he had a more nuanced view that I thought was helpful.
I think it's great that you kind of came full circle, about following the money, who's benefiting economically from this. It applies to the local level. It applies to the universe. People are not doing what they're doing out of goodness, the kindness of their heart. Some people are making a lot of money, and some people are dying because of that. In the end, it applies locally, it applies globally. But I think the beauty of it is what we're doing right now, right? We are talking about it. And there are voices out there that are being silenced, and the discourse is impoverished by that. And will keep on happening, and will keep on happening until there is a monolith of ideas. And that's prevailing already in the mainstream narrative, for instance, and even in the political parties. There is a coalescing of this central idea. And honestly, when Republicans and Democrats agree so much on something, we, the common folk, we need to worry about it. We need to. They hardly get together for a good cause. So yeah, I think it's nice that you pointed. I think I have so many disagreements with the left in the U.S. and even in the county. But I think the fact that we have this slate that we agree on one point. I see many differences between myself and among ourselves, members of the group. I think we were able to pinpoint one of the main causes of inequality, of the perpetuation of racism. Even if some people who are actually supporting the status quo are people of color, as they say. I don't automatically trust someone because of their race or their. I don't automatically judge anyone because of that either. I think we should always keep our eyes open and, again, as Mr. Hiruy said, follow the money and be very aware of who's making money on other people.
Yeah, I think in this country we have evolved a system that is more a collection of companies with the military.
Yeah.
And at the local level, there's smaller companies and maybe not as deadly, but they still are controlling things for the interests of those companies. And the defense contractors aren't doing this out of the goodness of their hearts, defending our freedom. They're making money. And these wars are very convenient for them to support that bottom line. Our agriculture, agribusiness, is making money, controlling food. And ultimately, we have a system that controls food distribution around the world to make people dependent on us, to buy their export crops that can't feed them, take their land, so they can't produce their own food. We control the banking, so that we control them. Then we control them militarily. 800 military bases. So we can talk about Russia. We can talk about China investing in a lot of different countries, but they don't follow them with military bases to protect their countries. That's a very big difference. 800 military bases. There are only, how many countries are there in the world? Eduardo, you probably know, a couple hundred.
Actually, the geography I learned was back in the times of the Soviet Union. There was a nice country named Yugoslavia that was destroyed. Yeah. So my count of countries has
always changed
a little. Yeah.
But we have 800 military bases.
Yeah, no, that's way too much. It's certainly more than the countries in the entire world. Even if you count the Soviet Union into all these different countries.
Right, military base in Cuba. Go figure. If you got a military base in Cuba, you can have a military base everywhere.
Exactly, and it happens to be a torture center in Cuba, right? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So then we can say that Cuba is torturing people. It's actually our military base. Yeah, it's the gross amount of power, and it's for the enrichment of the companies, the energy companies. We have departments, and it's almost like they're just controlled by these corporations. I've worked with many parts of the government. I've consulted for the U.S. government at lots of different levels. I even consulted for USAID for a period of time, and they tried to promote me to chair a committee, and I said, wait a minute, that you just tried to overthrow the government of Nicaragua. You funded a program specifically to overthrow the government of Nicaragua. Is that not true? And they didn't answer. And I said, well, I'm not going to work for you anymore. I mean, there's got to be limits. But I've worked for others of the government, the EPA and the USDA. And, there are some cases where alternative points of view can get in there. There's some things they do for people, but a lot of the control is based on the consultants from corporations, and that they have a lot of power, too much power, and that is how it works. And they fund the elections, and they get the government they want, two parties. So our system is a system of just keeping this whole system in place. So we can start locally. Seems like the thing to do. Start locally and start trying to take back the power and give the power to people for their own interests.
Well,
Yeah, no.
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Eduardo.
No, it's just that there's something in the news. I don't know how much of it is very common knowledge in the US nowadays, but in Brazil, they're still searching for a British journalist and a worker of the Brazilian Indigenous Bureau who are disappeared in the Amazon, and they were most likely killed by loggers and old explorers who are supporters of Bolsonaro and who have been empowered by Bolsonaro lately. And they haven't, there were different news about whether they had been located, their bodies had been located or not. But this may seem like an isolated incident. I mean, people have been killed all the time in Brazil and, in many countries in South America. Colombia, for instance, is, I think, it's like head to head with Brazil in the murder of social activists and environmental activists, indigenous leaders, and so forth. So that has been happening all the time. But now they may have killed a British journalist, a guy who used to write for The Guardian. And it's interesting to note that the person who might have been killed by this journalist, Bruno Pereira, the worker with the Indigenous Affairs Bureau, he was fired from his position within the federal government because he was he was bothering some powerful people in the Amazon. People who were, strong Bolsonaro supporters, people who were, behind much of the devastation in the Amazon. So he was fired. The person who was in charge of the ministry that fired him was a guy named Sergio Moro, who's a judge, the same judge that happened to jail Lula, so he wouldn't run for the presidential elections that ended up with Bolsonaro in power. Well, much of the U.S. press and the British press and the European Union press, they were like treating this guy as a corruption-fighting hero, this Sergio Moro guy, including The Guardian. And I think it's interesting how these things are related. Now, of course, there'll be outcry for what happened to these poor people in the Amazon and all that. But I think, again, people have to be held accountable. People have to take responsibility for what they did. They legitimized the rise of Bolsonaro to power. They underestimated or pretended to underestimate how fascist he was, because he was basically doing what the U.S. and European Union wanted to do in terms of the economy and in terms of basically neoliberalism and all that. So it's fascinating how one thing, when discussing one thing, they do not connect to this other thing. And it's important to connect it. People create certain political figures um, and they raise them, they promote them as these big heroes. And then when they do something terrible, people just forgot how much the corporate media promoted them. The same judge recently, he gave a talk about how combating corruption at the University of Chicago, which happened to be the university where I got my degree from. It's embarrassing. So all of this is connected. Once you depose a democratically elected government, once you sabotage a country's democracy in order to impose your economic interests, and then that leads to massacres and murders of indigenous people, of people of color everywhere, and this leads to environmental destruction. It's all connected. So we have to be very careful about that and not to consider one thing unrelated to the other one. Bolsonaro is always compared to Trump, benefits as much from democratic government as he did from Republican.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think we're gonna, close out the episode there. But I guess my last comment is, sort of the lens that I like to view, foreign policy through, and any sort of international event through is, both as an American, as somebody who's born and raised in this country, pays taxes in this country, will probably die in this country. first and foremost, I want to know what is my government's responsibility in any sort of given international scenario. And then on top of that, it just so happens that my government happens to be the most powerful government in the world, maybe in U.S. history, and by far as the most powerful economy and military. So I think it's very relevant, that Americans, view what role did the United States have on this, because it's very rare where they had no role, being the most powerful country in the world. And 9 times out of 10, almost any conflict, if you trace back, sometimes you don't even have to go back that far. If you trace back, the US's hands were all over it, whether it be the Russia-Ukraine thing and their role in, helping implement a coup in 2014, whether it's, I think U.S. media welcome Bolsonaro, who a lot of them now acknowledge as fascist, but at the time, like 5 years ago, they welcomed him with open arms, and bought in completely on the smear campaign that locked up a more left-aligned populist leader who's now hopefully going to run and win for president again after he finally got out. But whether it's in Ethiopia, Abiy Ahmed won the Nobel Peace Prize, and he's now helping perpetuate serious human rights violations. Sounds like a former president of the United States who also won a Nobel Peace Prize. But I can keep on going. The U.S. Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda. The U.S. was funding the Mujahideen at one point, and then they turned on us. So all these little crises that come up every couple of years that we're told that we need to get all up in arms about. If you just do a minimal amount of digging, you see that the United States put these people in the positions to act. How did Putin get in there? Because we forced them to, we put in Boris Yeltsin before him, and that led to Putin's rise, and that led to, these weak institutions that have allowed him to stay there in power for over 20 years. We forced their liberalized economy that was so weak and non-institutional that they have this oligarchy problem. And it's funny that we call their billionaires oligarchs. We call our billionaires billionaires, even though our billionaires actually have a lot more money than the supposed oligarchs. But so that's my take on the lens that needs, and that's why we should be very skeptical anytime the US is pointing its finger at any other country for supposed wrongdoings, even if the wrongdoings are actually real. Chances are the US was in a position to have stopped it at some point and didn't. And so we all bear that responsibility. Again, on that note, we're going to close it out. But thank you, Eduardo and Rick and Hiruy. And I hope people enjoyed the episode. Again, if you support what the Progressive Democrats of Howard County are doing, you want to join our email list, become a dues paying member, follow us on social media. You can check all of that out on our link tree. It's linktr.ee/HOCO Progressives. And with that, we will see you in episode 16, everybody. Take care. Thank you.